Okay, now we're just belaboring this point a little bit more, because if people who have investigated the Bible in order to discredit it have this set in their foundational arguments and can destroy an unknowing Christian, a Christian who hasn't done his homework. So he'll tell you, well, we start off with the Bible, Genesis chapters 1 and 2, different authors, contradictions. How can you believe the rest of it? Everybody thinks the Bible begins at Genesis chapter 1. Well, that's true. It goes back to the historicity of creation. But other passages can be consulted without having to go to Genesis and having a thorough knowledge of it. It's important that you do have a thorough knowledge of all 66 books. I haven't hardly met anybody that has a thorough knowledge of all 66 books yet. So, going into Genesis, the book of Genesis, everybody thinks that, well, that's if you can destroy that book, you can destroy everything else. And if they don't have an argument for that, their confidence can be destroyed. So let's get an argument and support our lesser educated Christian brothers and sisters, and then go out to the world and contend for the faith of the Bible. It's accurate. So the context of Genesis chapter 1 is panoramic and broad. I can write that way. And the context of Genesis chapter 2 is a close-up view of a person in a particular time frame, which was presented in Genesis chapter 1, namely the sixth day of creation and the man whom Jehovah God created, Adam. And this view includes minutia detail, such as the names and locations of 4 river tributaries, a specific garden which God planted and then placed into it the man he had formed, the fact that Adam needed a mate, the naming of specific animals and birds. The critics incorrectly assume that both chapters attempt to present the same events but use different styles to do this. I can write something of a panoramic nature, and I've done that many times, and then some more details. Well, let me go back, and just like anybody else, I don't have to have an expertise that Moses had to write in that same fashion. Moses wrote chapters 1 and 2 in the whole book of Genesis and the Pentateuch. The critics claim that the style of chapter 1 is stereotyped, measured, and precise, with recurring formulae such as the repetitive use of the verb to create, and that's correct. So what? This is because the subject matter and perspective of chapter 1 is more stereotyped, measured, and precise, with the recurring formulas such as the repetitive use of the verb to create. Now you switch horses in midstream, the same writer, and since chapter 2's subject matter and focus is more diversified and picturesque, a more diversified picturesque style without recurring formulae would be the most appropriate style for Moses, the writer, to use, the only writer. Another writer would not be needed to write chapter 2 because of the different style. We all have different styles. You write differently to your wife than to a business associate. God just simply inspired Moses to utilize the appropriate style to correspond to changes in the context. Most accomplished writers do this today when the context dictates it, and less accomplished writers as well. Refer to a local newspaper or a favorite novel or even a history book. They do the same thing. Same author. On the other hand, many of the other claims of the critics, such as chapter 2 is notably fresher, more spontaneous and primitive as compared to chapter 1, those are differences that are imaginary. Only in one's imagination could a claim be substantiated that chapter 1 is not spontaneous or fresh or primitive. What could be more spontaneous, primitive, and fresh than chapter 1 of Genesis 1, which begins, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Wow. Right in the middle. You talk about spontaneity. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. The style differences have no weight as an argument and simply reflect changes in subject matter. So critics claim that anthropomorphic references to God described as exemplifying human behaviorisms in Genesis chapter 2, who fashions, breathes, plants, takes, sets, brings, closes up, builds, walks, contradicts the God of Genesis chapter 1. But these are superficial. The critics have quite a superficial argument. Man in his finite mind cannot express ideas about God in anything but through anthropomorphisms anyway. Furthermore, chapter 1 of Genesis also expresses God in such equally anthropomorphic terms as called, saw, blessed, deliberated. Genesis 26 says, let us make. God worked for 6 days, then he rested. They're just picking at things that don't even exist, making it up when they don't have something substantive, which they don't at all. Chapter 2's lack of references to man being created in the image of God contradicts chapter 1, they say. But the critics assume beforehand that chapters 1 and 2 are 2 separate accounts of the overall creation process, which someone attempted to hook together. They ignore the simplest and most obvious interpretation, that chapter 2 is just a continuation of chapter 1 by the same author, providing more detail in a narrower and more focused area of what chapter 1 has already presented, from a panoramic to a close-up and detailed account. The narrower and close focus often demands a change in verb tenses and person and more details, but without having to replicate details covered. A change of authors is not needed to be made to do this. You just have to know how to read and write. You learned that in grammar school. If this is the case, and it is, then chapter 2, being a continuation of what was already stated in chapter 1, does not need to repeat what was just stated in chapter 1 relative to such things like man being created in the image of God. So we can go into chapter 2, but it moves on and departs from creation versus evolution. However, I notice here we do have a few things we can look at that brings up the point. Let's go back to the beginning. The beginning of chapter 2 is what? Verse 4b, second half of verse 4. So we have, in the day that the Lord God made earth and the heavens, we're going over the same thing. Toledoth, generations, refers previously in 2.4a. These are the accounts of the heavens and the earth when they were created. That's an ancient way of summarizing what I had just said before. A lot of times in a document we'll have it at the end in ancient days. Nowadays we put a chapter heading at the top or a paragraph heading at the top. So, let's go back to a little bit of science. Once completed and perfect in God's eyes, but then contaminated by the fall, the heavens and the earth are now devolving and deteriorating. I'm presuming we can go into the detail of the fall, but let's continue to focus on evolution versus creationism. Present processes are of conservation and disintegration, not the creative processes of innovation and integration that the creation account in the Bible says occurs. The passage in Genesis 2:1-3, of course, is a marvelous, assertive summary that God has now completed his work of creating and making all things. 4 times it is emphasized that God had finished his work, and 3 times it is emphasized that this included all his work. These points are stressed because it is vitally important for man to realize that the present processes of the cosmos are not processes of creating and making, and therefore would be forever impossible for him to understand about the origin of things apart from divine revelation. Both the ancient pagan evolutionists and the modern scientific, I put in quotes, evolutionists, continue over and over to repeat the same folly, trying to explain the origin and basic meaning of things in terms of a self-contained, closed universe, an attempt which is absurdly impossible. Every time we look at things today, we say, well, that's not how this all got here. We have 2 universal laws of thermodynamics that reflect creation's devolution and deterioration. The present processes of the universe are, without exception, processes of conservation and disintegration, as formulated in the two universal laws of thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics is one of energy conservation. Energy is neither created nor destroyed. In the beginning it was created. The second law of thermodynamics can basically be stated that in spite of this conservation, the first law, the energy available for useful work does not decrease so that the universe can be said to be running down. Example, the sun's energy is dissipating via heat into the universe. Oh, the available use for useful work does increase. The energy available for useful work does increase, does decrease, so that the universe can be said to be running down. Yeah, I'm contradicting myself there by not reading properly. Oh, read it properly. Example, the sun's energy is dissipating via heat into the universe. So everything is devolving, not evolving. Scientific observation of today's processes, including conservation and disintegration, indicates that such processes could never have produced life, the earth and the universe. Anything devolving couldn't have produced life, because you go from simple to more complex. The processes, and that takes more energy. The processes of the creation period, on the other hand, were processes of innovation and integration, creating and making, which are exactly opposite. Science can deal only with present processes, to which alone it has access. It should be completely clear to all who are not willing and willfully ignorant of that universal processes of conservation and disintegration could never produce a universe requiring almost infinite processes of innovation and integration for its production, pointing to an intelligent, infinite designer. Best example of that is in the Bible. Since we cannot observe what had happened at the creation of the universe, we are left with God's revelation to mankind in the Bible of what happened. All other books seem to be contradictory. Stick with the Bible until something better comes along. I can say that at least. Therefore, if we really want to know anything about this creation period, other than the fact that there must have been such a period to produce the universe, a fact certainly required by the implications of the two laws of thermodynamics, then such knowledge can be acquired only by divine revelation. But we have it in written form for us, passed down through the ages. So let's start reading there and refute it if you can. And that is exactly what we have here in this marvelous first chapter of Genesis, the divinely revealed record of the creation and formation of all things, how long it took, what the various events and divisions were, and what the order of development was, the relations of the various components, and all the other data which man could never be able to determine for himself through his own scientific observations. This completion of God's work, creation, is also stressed in books of the Greek Bible called the New Testament, Hebrews 4, 3-4, and 10, 11, 3, Ephesians 3 and 9. So, 2b-25, does it have any relevance here for our study of whether or not evolution or creationism has more relevance to what we see? I'm going over the contradictions. We don't see anything old or new, so I think we're going to move on to the next subject.